Hello. Avant tout, je dois dire que cet événement est, il y a une interprétation en français direct. Pour écouter en français, tu dois utiliser l'interprétation bouton à droite sur la fenêtre de Zoom et choisir le français. Hello, everybody. My name is Ehab Lotayef. I am one of the co-founders of Muslim Awareness Week, a partner in this event with the Quebec Writers Federation, who I'm also honored to be a board member of. I am here sitting on this virtual event on Jigjaga, or Montreal, as some of you know it, an unceded territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation. We, as Muslim Awareness Week, are extremely pleased to have this event in collaboration with the Quebec Writers Federation. Muslim Awareness Week is a series of events that happen at the end of January, the last week of January of every year, with the goal to increase the familiarity and knowledge of the Muslim community within Quebec, within the Quebec population, and we hope to spread to other places in Canada in the future as well. It is not an event, or is not a series of events about religion as per se, but it is more about people knowing people, because we believe that the only way for us to create a better society is after we know each other. Through this knowledge, we will be able to conquer the ignorance that may cause hate, and then may cause much worse than that, as we have seen in 2017 in Quebec City, and just last year in London, Ontario. Without further ado, I will invite Afrina Noor to say a word on behalf of the Quebec Writers Federation.
Thank you, Ehab, and hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Afrina Noor, and I am the Communications Officer at the Quebec Writers Federation. Our mandate is to promote, connect, and inspire English writers across the province, and we also host talks such as this one under our Writers Out Loud series. My colleague Riley, who is the Membership Services Coordinator, will be putting in the links to everything I talk about in the chat, so if you're interested, feel free to head on over there after I finish. We also offer 2 seasons of workshops, one in fall, one in spring. Our spring workshops are currently open for registration. Disclaimer, some are sold out, but head on over to this link and you'll be able to see what workshops we're offering. And we also offer scholarships. Currently, we have 3 need-based scholarships available for the spring 2022 session. Another one of our programs is called Storyscaping, where we offer online writing workshops for English-speaking youth and seniors throughout the province. We also have an outreach program where we send writers to work with at-risk youth. This is called Writers in the Community program. Starting this weekend, we will be resuming our Shut Up and Write Saturday morning writing group. This is free and available only to QWF members. So if you're not a member, don't be disheartened. You can become a member. It's super easy. And in light of the pandemic, we have a pay what you can policy. Membership perks include discounts on QWF workshops, which I just mentioned, being the first to know about events such as these, the QWF Gala, and what is happening in the literary community through an exclusive newsletter that I put together for QWF members every month. Speaking of the gala, this is an annual event, which I like to think of as the Oscars for English writers in Quebec. We have 7 award categories and 3 special prizes awarded each year. Today, we have the recipient of 2 QWF 2021 awards as a guest speaker. And on that note, I will return the screen to you, Ehab. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Afrina. So I will be now putting on a different hat, the hat of the moderator of this event. And I'm very pleased that we have with us 2 distinguished guests, 2 strong activists as guests on this event tonight. Let me introduce them. First, Samir Shaheen-Hussain. Samir has been involved in the anti-authoritarian social justice movements, including Indigenous solidarity, anti-police brutality, and immigrant justice organizing for nearly 2 decades. He is a member of the Caring for Social, he's a member of the Caring for Social Justice Collective and has written and co-written about state violence and healthcare for several publications. Fighting for a Hand to Hold, Confronting Medical Colonialism Against Indigenous Children in Canada, was awarded both the Concordia University First Book Prize and the Mavis Gallant Prize for NonFiction by the Quebec Writers Federation in November 2021. Samir is an assistant professor in the Faculty of Medicine and Health Sciences at McGill University and works as a pediatric emergency physician in Jigjaga, Montreal. Welcome, Samir.
Thanks, Ehab. So nice being here.
Ellen Gabriel has advocated for the collective and individual human rights of Indigenous peoples and sensitized the public on the issues and realities of Indigenous peoples since 1990. In 2004, Ellen was elected president of the Quebec Native Women's Association, a position she held until 2010. In 2005, Ellen received the Golden Eagle Award from the Native Women's Association of Canada. In 2008, she received the International Women's Day Award from the Barreau de Quebec, the Quebec Bar Association, and the Indigenous Women's Initiative Jigonsase Women of Peace Award for her advocacy work. Ellen advocates for gender equity, the revitalization of Indigenous language, culture, Indigenous self-determination and governance and traditions. She lives in Kanesatake and currently works at the Kanesatake Language and Cultural Center. Welcome, Ellen.
Thank you, Ehab. Hello, Samir.
So let me start by going back in memory lane personally with Samir, who our paths have crossed many, many times over the years. Samir comes from an activist family. I know his dad, an activist for a long, long time, and a friend. So I am very happy to be with Samir here today. And before we go into the medical side of this discussion, I would like to hear from Samir as an immigrant, as a child, as a son of an immigrant family. How were you introduced to activism, and how did you find yourself a footing in being an activist, rather than, I should venture to say, the vast majority of immigrant second generation children who are focused on other things usually?
Yeah, I mean, this is such an important but oftentimes difficult question. And where does one begin? I feel like, obviously, I was fortunate in the sense that I was, I grew up in a loving family, modest family. We grew up kind of in a working, lower middle class, mostly white neighborhood. And as you mentioned, family members had been or have been involved in various issues tied to justice and social justice in different ways, including through writing, but among other things as well. And growing up in that context, I personally experienced various forms of discrimination, including racism, growing up as a kid just outside of Montreal. And I think those experiences, prime us in certain respects of identifying with people who faced other forms of injustice. That being said, when I was younger, so that was like the human element, but I didn't necessarily, engage with politics in the way anyway that I do now. But there were examples, and I think one of the ones that comes to mind readily and ties in very significantly with being here on this panel with Ellen is in 1990. I was still in elementary school, but I remember we have pictures of my dad and my brother basically being at a demonstration in support of the resistance, led by folks in Kanesatake against the expansion of the golf course that the municipality of Oka was pushing at that time. And so that, for an immigrant kid, or a kid of immigrant parents, seeing that was significant. But that was something that was not talked about that much in our extended family, in our communities. And I think that's something that later on had an impact on me that was quite significant, which is that when I was in elementary school, the books that I read talked about Indigenous peoples, but the way they were referred to was still literally savages, right? And it was almost as if Indigenous people were a people of the past. They were literally, so they're in these history books, but they were erased from the present. And so I feel like even as a kid, even though I don't think I understood it in full consciousness at the time, but I think the siege of Kanesatake, like the Oka crisis, had that impact of making me realize, well, there are these people here still. And I feel like that's a question, unfortunately, that many of us don't necessarily ask. And I think, tying it into even Muslim Awareness Week, I'll fast forward a bit to 9/11, September 11th, 2001. When those attacks happened, we lived those experiences personally and politically, right? So personally, what happened around that time was actually my grandmother was dealing with dementia, was suffering from dementia, and she had not been very well. And my mom and I went to take her to the hospital on the morning of September 11th, 2001. And when we registered, the nurse, so we had basically pulled an all-nighter because my grandmother wasn't doing well. We didn't know anything that was going on or anything that had just happened. So when we registered and we were at triage, the nurse basically said, in French, "Do you know what your people did today?" And this is as we're registering. And I was like, this is before I had, we didn't have smartphones and things like this. And so I was like, no, I'm not sure what you're talking about. She said, well, Palestinians killed tens of thousands of people in New York City just this morning. And I was like, anyway, I obviously didn't know how to respond. I had no idea what was going on. I just said, well, I'm here for my grandmother, and she's not well, and we need to triage her and whatnot. So I think that from a personal aspect was just this really violent experience of how racism and discrimination can impact us in our most vulnerable moments, obviously. And only later did I realize what had just happened. But this was kind of important, I guess, in my own trajectory, because after that there was backlash, as you may remember, and as others may remember, across North America and in Europe, but at McGill campus, there was actually quite a fair amount of backlash against people who could be perceived as Muslim. And so in that context, we had organized, that was actually basically my first foray into social justice work, was we put together through Cupid McGill and a few other organizations, a Humanity for Hope event, which is basically supposed to be like an interfaith event to address issues around discrimination. And in that context, Ellen spoke because she was the director of the First People's House, and through that we became friends. And she at the time also became a mentor. And as we would continue to have discussions. I also did a rotation in Northern Ontario and Sioux Lookout, and with the different First Nations communities there, and realized the extent of discrimination, injustices faced by Indigenous communities in healthcare, but more broadly. And I feel like when I came back, then we basically started a group called the Indigenous People Solidarity Movement. Again, through ongoing discussions with Ellen and with a lot of other people, Indigenous activists, land defenders, and friends, comrades, it became very clear, something that Ellen says in her Afterword, which was basically, I came to realize that, colonial oppression and dispossession impact upon multiple generations and are the root causes for many of the social ills that impact Indigenous peoples. And so all that to say that was kind of like this, way for me to realize, given my own positionality in the world, what my responsibility was being on this land, which was primarily, first and foremost, if we're going to talk about injustices, the initial primordial injustice here is the fact that the lands that we're on were stolen, were exploited, and that there was a genocide that occurred here of Indigenous peoples. So, so that's kind of a bit of the trajectory. And so then I'll kind of fast forward when the campaign happened, the Hand to Hold campaign, which was basically a campaign that was launched to put an end to decades old practice of separating parents and caregivers from their children when they're being transferred for medical air evacuations. When that campaign was launched, it was kind of in the context of, having known a lot of this stuff and then putting that into context of realizing that when this practice, which disproportionately impacted Indigenous peoples in Northern Quebec, specifically Cree and especially the Inuit, we realized that this was all part of a longer history. And I want to just show, if it's okay, there's a 2-minute video clip that I think is really powerful. If we can cue that up, I'll just explain why I share this right after. It's a 2-minute music video from 2018.
That prevented sick children from traveling with their parents aboard medevac flights has been widely criticized in Quebec. After recent pushback, the government yielded and promised to let parents on board. At a community event at this mosque, the health minister was asked why that hasn't happened yet. CBC obtained a recording of his response, where he guaranteed someone intoxicated will be kicked off of a flight in the next 6 months.
Where someone will not be not allowed to get on the plane. Why? Because no one agitated, drugged, under whatever influence would get on the plane at any cost. That will not happen. And that happens all the time.
Those words led to a chorus of condemnation.
To have comments like that by a minister is totally appalling and unacceptable. We're going to demand that the minister resign from his position.
The head of an organization that represents Inuit in Quebec's north says he needs to apologize, and I don't think that will be enough. He needs to go. The trust is gone. Barrette backpedaled today, at first saying that people wrongly assumed he'd been talking about Indigenous people when he meant it more generally. Then, later, he offered this as an apology.
I can understand the sensitivity of that and the reaction, and I apologize for that. I'm quite sorry about that, but at the end of the day, can we move on?
The Premier is standing in solidarity with his health minister as a provincial election looms.
I think he's sorry that his words have been interpreted that way. I suggest that we leave it there.
Barrette did call the mayor of Kuujjuaq to apologize. The mayor says he does not accept the apology. He's demanding that the minister resign immediately. Jayla Bernstein, CBC News, Montreal.
So I share that for a couple of reasons. One is a hopeful one, and the other one is maybe a bit less hopeful. But the hopeful or more inspiring one is that, that, and I mentioned this in the book, but that whole episode happened because, as was mentioned, the former health minister, made these comments during a pre-electoral visit of Islamic Community Center on the South Shore. And someone, I guess, who had been following the campaign basically took it upon themselves to ask what was going on with this practice and why there wasn't a new policy that was allowing caregivers to accompany their kids to be in place. And then he kind of went on this rant. And to me, I thought it was a really powerful show of solidarity, by the person who ended up recording the health minister without the minister knowing, and then ended up, I guess, sharing it with the media. Because to me, it kind of was this example of how, there can be relationships that are built, in this case, between like Muslim communities and, Inuit communities, where the state is kind of taken out of the equation. And that has so much power. And that's kind of those are the kinds of relationships that historically we have not built, and that we need to build.
When I started, I said that many of the immigrants' kids don't go into activism, but I will take that back a little and say, when particularly in the Muslim community, those of them who go into activism go into some sort of Muslim activism through the mosque. What is unique and very much appreciated on my side about you is that you did not just limit yourself to that niche. You really worked for society at large. And the example you gave really is heartwarming for me, that at a certain point in the last few years, this was 4 years ago, the Muslim community, an electoral visit targeted towards the Muslim community opened issues that have no direct relation to just the Muslim community. And this is really what the hope is, to open those doors. And maybe I'll invite Ellen into the discussion here, because the interaction between the Muslim community or any immigrant community, any newcomer, recent community, and their knowledge of the suffering of the native people and how they interact with this, I think is extremely important. Ellen, what would you like to say about that?
Well, I think it's really important that, people don't stick to a certain niche that they see, as you said, you get to know everybody. So understanding who's your neighbor, understanding who's living around you. I think it's really important that you understand the richness of the communities, but also be aware of the flaws. And as Samir has done, I'll just speak for myself, but I know other Indigenous activists do the same thing. We support other people, the BIPOC communities. We support human rights. We know what it's like to be oppressed. We know what it's like to be marginalized, and we stand, shoulder to shoulder with other people who feel that oppression. Because it's, we are living on this same planet. We are living the same kind of foods in the sense of where we buy our foods. And I think it's been a very big injustice to put people in silos, as we have been, because it's 2022 and people barely know anything about Indigenous people other than blockades and pipelines. And we are much more than that. So I think that it's, we go on, it's kind of like a roller coaster ride. When I first started, everybody was getting together, didn't matter which community you came from. People were outraged at what was going on with Indigenous people because of colonization. And then it sort of fades, right? Whereas we as Indigenous people, this is our lives, this is our reality. We can't let it fade away. Because this is our survival. So I think it's really important that people stay consistent in their activism, rather than just like, it's a good thing to put on their CV. I was once an activist for this. For people who are oppressed, as Indigenous peoples are, we need that constant support, and we need to share what does it mean to be a good ally.
I do remember we crossed paths twice before, maybe more, but twice I remember. Once you were invited to speak in an event organized at McGill by the Silk Road Institute, which is a cultural Muslim Muslim initiated group, and I believe I was the MC at that event, which I think was a great step. But it doesn't happen. It doesn't happen enough that the Native voice is heard within diverse communities within society. Do you see that there is a change happening there? I mean, that must have been 10 years ago, but and the other time we crossed paths, which really supports what you said. You were there to support the Canadian boat to Gaza and trying to break the blockade of Gaza when we were launching. So it is true. I believe that it's very important and true that those who support different or fight against different injustices stand together. So do you see a change happening in the understanding of diverse minority communities, new immigrant communities, towards understanding the plight of the First Nations?
Well, Indigenous people, I think are, as I said, it goes like a roller coaster, and I don't think it's consistent enough. I think people look at today and it's like, wow, this is happening. It's like, well, this was going on decades ago, and each new generation that comes up think that they've invented something new or that they're pioneers in something, but we have to understand that we are all of us are standing on the shoulders of the giants, the pioneers who pushed for social change and social justice, and that there is always a minority who have the resources to try and crush movements that would call and bring about, I think, the kind of changes that people are looking for equality, for equity, anti-racism. So I'm always encouraged, and it always gives me hope, but I wish we were further along than we are today, because for me it's not acceptable that a country that purportedly is a human rights defender at the international stage oppresses Indigenous people the way it does. When we talk about land dispossession, that's still going on. This is not a post-colonial era. This is colonialism that we are all living through, and that people are just ignoring, as if it's a hindrance to their economic prosperity. And for us as Indigenous people, we want people to sit and discuss with us. We don't want to have to lecture people, but we also have been demanding changes within an educational system that is really actively trying to erase any footprint that we have on our homelands.
Samir, you called Ellen a mentor, and the book you wrote, which is a great book, was based on a campaign that, should I say, you led, or at least you were a part of, that I think started with your strong feeling about how unjust it is for Indigenous children who are evacuated to Montreal, or probably to elsewhere as well, are denied the possibility of having an adult, a mother, a parent, a guardian with them, and that appeared to you as totally unfair. How did your relationship with Ellen have an effect towards you working on this campaign in particular?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I mentioned Ellen as being a mentor to many of us, but I would also like to think that, we've developed a friendship since then as well. So there's that element of exchange, and for sure, Ellen played a very significant role for me 20 years ago and has continued to do so. But it's also been many other, people, authors, writers, educators, activists over the years who basically kind of helped me understand that, we live in a, what many people refer to as a global apartheid, right? We live in in a socio-political context that privileges profits over people. And once you have that perspective, it kind of becomes a bit more easy to, interpret what we see in terms of injustices and being able to trace back to their root causes. That being said, for this particular case of the non-accompaniment rule, what was interesting, and I think it speaks to how insidious these kinds of practices can be, is that, I did all of my medical school at McGill. I did almost my entirety of my pediatric residency at McGill. I was a staff pediatric emergency physician for almost 10 years until that summer of 2017, where we received those two kids from Nunavik a few weeks apart. That really jarred me. And there have been other people who had tried to change this practice.
Could you tell us a little bit more about those two cases in particular?
Yeah, so I mean, one was a preschooler who had fallen off an all-terrain vehicle and was sent down to us for a suspicion of abdominal and head trauma. And the other one a few weeks later was a child who had swallowed a coin that was stuck in her throat. And both of these kids were sent alone, right? And I was the charge physician in the emergency department for both of these kids, spread apart by a few weeks. And when I went into their room, all I saw was them alone. But then at the same time, what I also saw was kind of these years and these generations of children that had been ripped apart by the colonial apparatus, the Canadian colonial state. And so, but what's also interesting is that initially I just kind of thought it was a rule that was applied across the board because it was a province-wide rule. And that was that. It actually took a colleague of mine who was, who's not Indigenous, who's not racialized, but who basically wrote me a few days after the first kid and said, unfortunately, the reason this is still happening is because of systemic racism. And so it was that made me kind of say, oh, really? And then I started looking into it with others. And then we definitely, kind of made the case that even though the practice impacted all kids across the province living in remote and rural areas, Indigenous children from Northern Quebec and specifically Inuit kids from Nunavik were disproportionately impacted. And that's kind of, what led to the campaign. And then the campaign happened. There were a lot of ups and downs with the campaign. There's that quote by Barrette that he made in June of 2018. There was the ongoing refusal of systemic racism, recognizing systemic racism by François Legault, who's now premier. And so one of the reasons, I guess, for me of wanting to write the book, because I guess after all, we're talking about writing as activism this evening, but for one of the reasons for me to write the book was basically so that people no longer have an excuse to say we didn't know. A few weeks after the campaign was launched, there was a former pediatric resident, who had written me because she was really enthused, excited, encouraged by the fact that the campaign was launched, that maybe things are going to change finally. And she had said in her email to me, she said, I can't even recall all the times in my residency that I was in a situation where this policy affected a child I was taking care of. We knew it was the rule, we knew it was awful, and yet we just kept going. And I think one of the reasons for writing the book was really basically to show that, and like I was complicit in this, I was a part of this structure. And so one of the points of the book was basically to say that, we can basically no longer just keep going, right? And I think what's important to keep in mind, when the book came out on September 24th, 2020, 4 days later is when Joyce Echaquan died in a hospital in Joliette after receiving, racist and sexist treatment. And so I think it just underscored how much work there still is to be done, and the importance of solidarity, because one of the reasons I showed that video earlier is that, there were calls from communities, from leaders, from activists, from Indigenous politicians, when Barrette had made those statements to say, to call for his resignation, as was mentioned in the video. But those calls, weren't heeded. So he continued in his position until the end. And I was asked to testify at Joyce Echaquan's coroner's public inquiry. And at that time, one of the things I brought up as a question is wonder out loud whether in 2018, if there had been more of an effort, more solidarity expressed with Indigenous communities at that time to ensure that Barrette resigned from his position, to essentially give across the message that there's zero tolerance for racism and discrimination in our healthcare system, then maybe, I mean, we'll never know, but maybe 2 years later, a nurse and an orderly would not have felt as comfortable making those kinds of statements to Joyce Echaquan, right?
I agree with you 100%, and I guess this is a part of the fight that we're having right now, just to admit that there is systemic racism in Quebec, because just by the lack of admittance, it's easier for those who want business as usual to continue, and it is a huge problem that the head of the government is in denial this way, or is in refusal to this. It's not just because of the word, but because there are no actions that are built on the word. I'm going to just address our audience and say there is the question and answer window. We are going to try to give you a chance to put your questions there, and we are going to be taking time out of the time of this panel discussion for your questions. So please put your questions in the question and answer, and we will monitor them, and we'll allocate enough time, hopefully, to get most, if not all, of the questions answered. Back to you, Samir. I'm very interested about the influence of different people on your activism as well. And I recall a common friend, and I guess a mentor, maybe to both of us as well, Abby Lipman, who passed away a couple of years ago. And in the medical field, as in the academic field, there are very few activists. There are very few people who are willing to put their professional success on the line to fight for what they believe, and to say what needs to be said to inspire or bring in change. There is something that I remember. I don't remember exactly how true it is. Maybe my memory is failing me. But did you tell me one day when you were still in medical school that you're not sure that you're going to practice medicine after you finish? That was true. Yeah, was it?
Memory.
So, I mean, again, take us a little bit on how you made the decisions, and how do you feel now after the book is published that this is affecting your career or your work or the environment where you work in?
Yeah, I mean, I think for many people who are engaged, and it's not even a matter of being engaged, but who just have I guess a bit of a visceral reaction to injustice, people will often question themselves in terms of deciding whether what they're doing, is it the right thing, is it the right use of their time and their energy. And the problem with, one of the issues with working in medicine as we know it is that, for one, it doesn't give you very much time to do other things. But two, it's also an incredibly conservative environment. And to me, I can't remember exactly when that was that I'd mentioned that to you, but it doesn't surprise me. But, for a very long time, and even to this day, there's often questioning of, is this the best the best use of one's time? But I do think that there are privileged relationships that get developed, working in healthcare, working as a frontline healthcare provider. And for me, that's actually really important, being able to see and be part of people's most intimate lives when they're very vulnerable and they need support in terms of healthcare. It's a really privileged role, and I don't take that lightly. But I don't think I would be able to do only that, because I think it has to come with an attempt at addressing the systemic, the root causes of why people get sick in the first place. And one of the reasons, I mean, Ellen is way too humble, but one of the reasons I'd asked her to write the afterword to the book is because I didn't want people to come out of reading the book to think that this is just about healthcare in a very limited scope, in the sense that, and I think Ellen does this very beautifully in her afterword, which is to increase, to widen the lens, to make us realize that when we're talking about health and well-being, that is tied to so many more things that go beyond this little medical system. It has to do with the foods we have access to, the medicines we have access to. It has to do with, for many Indigenous communities, we hear over and over again the importance of ceremony, and how colonial policies have prevented Indigenous communities from being able to basically take care of themselves and their communities. And so to me, that broader global picture is really important, because otherwise we just kind of are going to be spinning our wheels. Unless we recognize that there are larger structures that have to be dealt with. And that's why it's so important to actively be confronting things like colonialism. As Ellen said, that's ongoing. This is not just a thing of the past. And only by doing that is there any significant hope that things are going to improve. And I think we just saw this weekend, maybe it's a bit of a diversion, but we saw this weekend in Ottawa, these I don't know what to call them, even protests, I guess, or whatever, these rallies that occurred in the context of these truckers' mobilization, and we also saw images of Confederate flags being there, and to me, one of the things that struck me was what the consequences were. So the fact that it's happened on on January 29th, and that it canceled the vigil that was supposed to take place in Ottawa to commemorate the Quebec City mosque massacre victims and their families, that's significant. Similarly, it's also significant that those protests were allowed to happen when in the same context, in the same time that we're living in, the Wet'suwet'en, who have been, engaging in actions to safeguard their land, are violently criminalized and repressed by the RCMP. So the same police officers who are letting these protests happen would suppress Indigenous self-determination. That's not by accident. And I feel like we need to recognize that and make those links. And if writing is one of the ways to be able to do that, then that's great. But I really just see the writing aspect as being, a tactic or a strategy among other things. It's not a be all and end all. And my acquisitions editor at McGill Queens early on had said, when you're writing this book, show, don't tell. And that's kind of what I tried to do is show this history, but how it's rooted in this longstanding medical colonialism. So that way we can, people can understand that it goes way beyond just, healthcare, that it's a much, much larger issue than that.
We titled this panel "Writing as Activism," and I would like to bring Ellen in again with as somebody who is an activist and a strong believer in her cause and in many causes, as you mentioned, Ellen. What is the role of writing that you see in bringing across the ideas you want to bring, the cause you want to bring, and also to gain more allies or enlighten people to the struggle? What is the role of writing for an activist?
Well, it's making it concrete. It's putting your words onto something you know, whether it's in a book or an article on the web or in a newspaper, people can read them at their own leisure. They can learn slowly. They can read over once again something they didn't understand. I think there's a generation that think reading is out of date. I saw one of the comments, but I think that it's up to the individual, right? It's very individualistic, and I think it's wonderful that we still have this sort of tool to help us in our activism. Writing, I think, for me, having been invited by Ricochet last summer to write some editorials, I think has sort of expanded that reach, where we are always talked about, we are always talked at. We never have the opportunity to have that platform to bring our voices to the forefront, simply because the media looks at people like me, who's a radical, as too dangerous to put on the air, I guess, or just for whatever reason. But the issues are very complex. There's centuries of this oppression that has been we've absorbed, and we see that it's not changing. You had asked earlier about if I was enthusiastic or hopeful about, is things are changing when I really see very little incremental changes, and writing brings about that sort of opportunity that are missed otherwise. And I think, if you write well, people will listen, whether they agree with you or not. But it's also leaving a legacy behind. I'm not too sure what the future holds for human beings on this planet. But I think there's one thing that I know for sure: even if technology dies, the written word will be there. So there's something hopeful in that, and I feel very privileged to have that opportunity to be able to do so. I'm working on a book right now, actually, to talk about my activism and some of the things that I've seen. I want to comment on what's been going on in Ottawa, and for sure, I think people feel a lot of fear, and sometimes it's just manifesting that fear in on paper or in an internet blog. It's just helping. Maybe it'll help others. Whereas for this, some people might not be interested. But maybe one day there's going to be an opportunity for people to hear people like myself, who have been pushing back against the machine. And maybe that's through the written word. I don't know. I just know that we have tried every single kind of way to get social justice. We have tried. And so we need to use all the tools available to us.
Since a lot of our audience are writers, do you think that fiction reaches people's minds and hearts more than nonfiction in changing the realities of the struggles for certain causes, opens people's eyes to things they didn't see? Do you think that out of your own experience, that fiction, because it could be more interesting, more dramatic, could be more effective?
You're talking to me?
Yeah.
Okay. I think you should use whatever is. We are. When you have a good story to tell, I don't think it matters in which form it takes, as long as it's something that is recognizable and people can relate to. There's a lot of good fiction out there, and there's a lot of good nonfiction, and I don't know. I think with nonfiction you can stretch the truth or realities a little bit, and in a way, and you can manipulate it in a way that reality won't let you. But I think both stimulate discussion and stimulate the mind. So I like both.
Samir, your nonfiction book was very well received, acclaimed, and won prizes. But I would like to hear your input as well about this question. I personally was moved towards a few causes actually through fiction. So what do you think the impact, the comparative impact of fiction versus nonfiction would be in your mind?
Yeah, I mean, I guess similar to Ellen, like I feel like it's hard to make a distinction in terms of what's better or what's more effective. I think I think there are different outlets to be able to creatively express stories. And fiction, for me, has played a significant role, whether it's books, or novels, but also film, significantly so. But one of the things I guess I would try to do in Fighting for a Hand to Hold was actually kind of melding these things. So obviously it's a nonfiction book, but I think so much of what I have learned has been also through through music, through film, through novels, and I tried to in different parts throughout the book draw examples. So one that comes to mind is like using song lyrics from hip hop artist Samian, or using an excerpt from Sherry DeMaline's book called Marrow Thieves, where she kind of creates a dystopic universe, but that's very similar to to colonial Canada, and makes a critique of healthcare in a way that's kind of very almost visionary. So I think that they both have their importance. But I think one of the most important things, at least for me as someone who's a settler, racialized settler, especially with writing this book, one of the things that I needed to be very careful about, and hopefully I was able to do it in a respectful way, is there's kind of two stories being told in the book, right? One is the story that I wanted to tell, which was kind of casting a mirror to the medical establishment. And so it's a story of what the medical establishment has done, and the role it's played in the colonial project. And so that I felt like I was very, it was very kind of easy for me to do that, because it's kind of my responsibility. The part that was more challenging was making sure that the voices and perspectives of Indigenous children, their families and communities was represented and was centered. And so that was the challenge. Hopefully it was done in a way that's okay, but I think that's one of the thing that's really important, is making sure the stories are told in a way that's respectful. I remember, I think soon after the book came out, Ellen was saying that the book is going to be, I'm sorry if I misquote you, Ellen, but I think it said something like the book is going to be important for Indigenous communities. And that kind of, I remember when she said that, it took me aback, because I was like, no, but that's not who this is for, because Indigenous communities already know these stories, obviously, because they've been telling these stories for years and years, and no one's been listening. But in the end, as with many other things, she was right, because I think it did reach, like the medical establishment. But what's been really heartening and powerful and moving has been that it also reached different Indigenous communities and nations in a way that has felt really meaningful, and in a way also where there's a lot more work that still needs to be done, and hopefully that can continue to happen, and that the book has played a role and hopefully in allowing that and facilitating that and supporting that.
Thank you.
Could I just add something? Yeah.
Sure, absolutely.
Samir, you're always sparking some stuff in the conversations we've had over the years. I think I would say the same thing about Samir, that he's very humble, and one of the things I think is that he is a doctor, and he's coming from a very humanist sort of point of view. And I have to choose my words really, really well here. I told him nobody would have listened to you if you had been an Indigenous doctor. I don't think. I think it's because he's not an Indigenous person in some ways that his book became, and it's so well written though. I mean, it's so well researched, it's so well written, it deserved all the awards that it got. But in many respects, it's like, it's kind of like when you come from a small community and you try and tell people and you urge people, this is what's happening, this is what we should do, and then when you, nobody listens to you, but then when somebody from, another outside the community comes in and all of a sudden, oh wow, yes, it's true, right? It's sort of this phenomenon, I don't know what you want to call it, but I'm very grateful to Samir and his wife Nazila for putting, doing the research and just for Samir to take this issue on, because I think we would still be in the same spot where it was years ago if it had not been for Samir and people like him who cared enough to take the time to bring this issue to light, because Indigenous people's voices are silenced consistently, and this is about being a good ally. I think this is what Samir is, a good ally in the sense, but he's also a good human being. And it's just one of these things in society where systemic racism is not recognized because it is the norm. And I think Samir was brave enough to take on an establishment that he's also, as he said, he's part of. But he gave a voice to the voiceless, and I'm really grateful to that.
I'm very happy that you mentioned Nazila, Samir's partner, and I think that you also, to be able to go to challenges like that, you need a strong partner, and I think that it's fair to mention her here, and that she for sure had a role. I didn't know that she had a role in researching the book itself, but the role of support that I'm sure she gave throughout Samir's activism in general is sizable and commendable. I wanted to ask one last thing before we go to the public's questions, and it's a question based on what you just said, Ellen. You mentioned, and I agree with you 100%, if Samir was from the Indigenous community, he would not have been heard as much, for sure. But do you think if he was white Caucasian, he would have been heard even more?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to acknowledge the elephant in the room, right? We need to say that there is certain privilege given to a certain group of people. I think for sure that there would have been resistance from the establishment anyways, but I think that it takes courage, to break the norm, to sort of break out of that system, because as Samir says, it's happening to somebody else. They're just following the policy, the protocol, and he could have just left it at that. He could have just said, it's a shame that this is happening. But I think one of the most powerful things that he's done or has said is that by him writing the book is that you can't say that you didn't know about it anymore. And I think that's what writing does, I guess. To add to your question previously, is that when you put things on paper or whatever, it's out there. It's not like a tweet that will disappear in by the end of the year, but it's really something that people can grasp in their minds.
Thank you. Let's now I will like to introduce Laurie Schubert, the Executive Director of the Quebec Writers Federation, who thankfully, and I thank you very much, Laurie, has agreed to help with this panel and screen the questions so that I can focus on the discussion. And I guess we have a large number of questions, so I will let Laurie decide where to start.
Okay, first I just want to say we got a lot of questions. I might not get to everyone. And if you raised a question that was subsequently brought up by one of our panelists, I probably won't ask that question either, since they've pretty much dealt with it. Also, a lot of these are comments, not questions. So I'm going to start with the questions and then we'll see about the comments. So from Maya, how can you reach people through writing when reading, at least serious reading, seems to be going out of fashion? It wasn't directed to either one of you in particular.
Well, I don't know if it's because of the pandemic. I mean, I used to really like going to bookstores, and I haven't gone since the pandemic started, actually. So I don't know. I think it's, if you want your children to like books, then you read to them when they're young, right? I'm a person that has to read stuff over. I really like science fiction. I really like biographies and things that are very compelling. You know, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee was one of the first books that sort of awoke my inner activist. And that was like many, many decades ago. Agwazasne Notes was also something that I used to read and be aware of what was going on in Indigenous communities in Canada and the US. So I think that it's not, I don't think it's losing any steam. I think maybe for some people it might be, but I don't think it's losing any steam in any way, shape, or form.
Okay. The next question I have is from Alexi Perry-Cox. Do you have a reading list for the writers and readers amongst us? Writing as activism, indeed. The connections between the speakers are extraordinary ones, and I often want to source the activists and thinkers, bringing these differences and connections and struggles together in a readable way, since I know there are many. This goes on for quite a while. So the question is, does either of you have any recommendations? Can we at QWF perhaps get a hold of those and make them available on our website?
I mean, I can just quickly chime in. I mean, it's so hard. Like Ellen said, there's so many books, I think, that have impact on us at various points in our lives and things like that. One of the reasons I wrote the book the way I wrote the book was precisely to kind of honor the knowledge that I've learned from different forms of media, but including books. So, you know, I can't remember how long the bibliography is, but it's like, I think it's about 50 pages. So one option, if someone's really interested, is flipping through that, because some of, you know, there are kind of like a lot of quote unquote classics that are there that, at least for me, were really important in terms of understanding the importance of, you know, things like why reconciliation is not relevant until we can talk about reparations and restitution, you know, resurgence movements, all of these things, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, they're all there. Yeah, Ellen just mentioned Audra Simpson, who I also cite in the book. I did put together a anti-colonial reading list for 49th Shelf. So I've just put the link in the chat. I think there's probably over 20 books in there. They're all, you know, by authors who are based in quote unquote Canada, but so I didn't go beyond that because I wasn't allowed to. But maybe that'll be helpful. And it's a wide range, including children's books as well that are there. So it's intended for people of all ages, all kinds of interests.
Great, that's great that you have that right on hand for us. Ellen also mentioned Leanne Simpson and Maria Campbell. I'll go on to the next question from Wendy Allen. Ellen, you said that people need to know what it is to be a good ally. You mentioned staying connected. Could you talk more about who makes a good ally?
I think it's somebody who takes the time to actually learn and sit and listen and to ask the questions. You know, like, I don't know who, we hear this often, there's no such thing as a stupid question, right? I think when we are learning, we're always fearful, but the best way to be an ally is not to speak on our behalf and not to pretend to understand us, but to help us in the work that we're doing, whether it's, you know, galvanizing people for a protest, talking about a book, a particular book, and having discussions, inviting people who are actually living those realities. But also, I think there's one thing that I find really people don't do enough of, which is pressure their members of parliament or members of the National Assembly. It shouldn't just be up to Indigenous people to put the pressure on or to write these things, to say that here's an injustice. The best way to be an ally, I think, is like to be a good friend. What would you do for your friend, right? You respect them, you respect their voice, you are compassionate for them, and you have the courage to help them at their darkest points. I think that's not blind loyalty, but sort of unconditional love, in the sense that you would, as we've talked about during this session, which is have the courage to break from the pack and think for yourself, based on the knowledge that you've acquired, based on the knowledge and the realities that you know about, instead of the ones that you think is the right versions of history. I don't think we get enough opportunities to be able to make the changes that we need to. So, yeah, I guess that's it.
Thank you.
One thing, if I could just add, Laurie, maybe just to add to Ellen's, and I guess I have like a different positionality in the sense that I'm a racialized settler. And so I feel like there's that the importance of engaging in anti-colonial and decolonial work. But then I myself have experienced racism. And so there's that question of, with other people, trying to figure out how to navigate these things. But one of the things I think, I feel like I learned from Ellen, and I can't imagine the patience that she has had for all these years of like mentoring people, whether she's wanted to or not. But it reminds me of this line that I think Maya Angelou quoted Al-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz, also known as Malcolm X, as saying, he said, "Don't be in such a hurry to condemn a person because they don't do what you do or think as you think or as fast. There was a time when you didn't know what you know today." And I feel like that line is kind of really a reminder of when we're talking about allyship, or at least when I'm thinking of it, is just the importance of people who are engaging in these issues, is also being patient. At least it's something that I've tried to learn from those who have been patient with me, and hopefully that's an important lesson moving forward as well.
Great, thank you. A question from Julie Barlow for you, Samir. Could you talk about the impact your book is having within the medical profession and perhaps beyond? I imagine you are frequently invited to speak about it. Do you feel your message is getting out?
Yeah, I mean, I think, a friend of mine had said that if the book had been published in 2019, it probably would have been considered too radical. But the fact that it was published in 2020, after the pandemic, after the brutal death of the murder of George Floyd and the death of Joyce Echaquan, the whole political terrain shifted in such a significant way across the board in so many levels, that in healthcare, it's definitely something that people are now starting to more meaningfully engage with. But I think it brings up a really important point that I didn't get a chance to say earlier, but I do mention in the book, which is that, yes, the book is getting a fair amount of attention. I probably have been invited to do over 100 talks since the book was launched, including many times in the healthcare setting for medical grand rounds and with medical students and nursing unions and things like that. But one of the things that's really important is that there have been people who have been doing this work for years and decades before, right, including in healthcare. And I think Ellen alluded to it earlier, but what's so important is recognizing that this work has been longstanding, and the only reason now that it's getting the attention is because the terrain has shifted, and the terrain has been prepared in so many ways by, as Ellen said, we stand on giants, by other people who have come before and who are continuing to do the work, oftentimes in the shadows. But to answer the question, yes, there has been a fair amount of reception. I don't know how long it's going to last, because as I mentioned earlier, the medical establishment is kind of inherently a conservative, establishment. There are there's authors Raj Patel and Rupa Maria. They came out with a book recently. They're based in the US called Inflamed, Deep Medicine and the Anatomy of Injustice. And they have this one line where they basically talk about medicine, and what they say is basically that the history of modern medicine is the history of colonialism. And I think that's kind of so apt and so telling. And it's kind of just a matter of time before that conservative element is going to kind of try to creep back in. And so that's where it's really important for those of us in healthcare to keep pushing back to make sure that we can create these spaces. Because at the end of the day, all we're talking about is making sure that people have dignified healthcare, right? Like that's ultimately what it's coming back to. But even that, people are going to fight back against, which is surreal.
Do you get pushback in those public events? I'm sure there are people that want to push back, but do you get overt pushback, or mostly it's positive reception?
It's variable. Sometimes there will be pushback. Other times, I think right now is not the greatest time. Although after what we saw happen this weekend, maybe things are going to shift again. But I feel like the last year has maybe not been the best time for many people who would otherwise have wanted to push back, especially in spaces where where these kinds of events are happening. But I think that will. I worry that that's going to change, right? And the people who've kind of been silent in quotes, but feel really threatened by things that Ellen has been working for years. So many other people have been working on these issues for years. When those people who feel threatened by this and want to maintain their privilege and their power are going to start asserting themselves, and I think that's a concern. That's a significant concern that we're going to have to watch for.
The next question is from one of your fellow finalists for the QWF Awards, Samir, but it actually isn't directed to either one of you in particular, so either of you can answer, or both. How can a writer try to ensure that they are not preaching to the choir? That is, to try to have their writing reach and potentially affect the ideas and opinions of those of differing views.
You speak from the heart. I think if you're sincere and you're genuine, people will hear your message. And if you're consistent, again, it goes back to that issue of consistency. But this is really a medium that I think, I guess, if we think about writing, there are bureaucrats who write policy that perpetuates systemic colonization. There are, the medical establishment followed a policy written by a bureaucrat based on the norm of racism. Those things all took someone's mind to put onto, pen and paper, and it's the establishing, implementing that. The medical establishment was used as a tool. Did the people who implemented those policies, did they feel that this was a good idea? Did they accept the fact that Indigenous children were put into outhouses as a policy when they had tuberculosis, and then sent them home knowing that they would spread it to their families? I think writing is deeper than just an idea. Writing is about convincing someone that you have something to offer. For the medical establishment, I think it was for them, because they're as Samir said, such a conservative establishment. It was about maintaining some sort of ethics, which was not applied to Indigenous children and not applied to Indigenous peoples or people of color. Being genuine, I think, to talk about historical injustices, I think says it all. I think it's like what Samir has said. He investigated, he came from it as a human being, not as an ethnographer, not as an archaeologist or an anthropologist. He came from it as a human being, and I think that's something that many bureaucrats need to know and understand. And I think as writers, you have that one up from the bureaucrats in that you don't have the restrictions. You don't have that pressure bureaucrats have to do, which is to toe the line. I wish there were more people who took an interest in social justice. I wish there were more people who wanted to send a message out there that would make the real changes that we need in 2022 to see white supremacists rising up, claiming human rights. I think is appalling. To see that in this day and age, when we've seen so many civil rights and human rights accomplishments, that you know, just to undo that just takes, you know, something that is on ink, which is money. It's like it's more than just an ideology. It's also the resources to be able to make those changes. And you know, writing means that you have the privilege to be able to sit and to write, which many people don't. And so I think the question should be turned back at the person who asked that. How do you think that you should convince people your ideas?
Thank you, Ellen. A question from Sandy Sholema. One of the first books I read written by an Indigenous woman was Bobby Lee, Indian Rebel by Lee Maracle of blessed memory. What role do you see autobiography as having in consciousness raising and solidarity with people who may belong to communities other than our own?
If we look at the popular culture, I'll just keep going because I think I look at Samir and he's just looking at me. If you look at popular culture, that's what it is. It's storytelling. It's stories about the lives of people, and it's extremely important, I think, because what we see happening on the big screen, anyways, it's starting to come out, but you know, people don't understand or they're not aware of this is something that strikes me when I'm sitting and watching a movie and I'm thinking various different kinds of movements, the Black civil rights movement. We were still stuck on the reserves. We were still stuck without a voice. We were still stuck under the Indian agent, and that wasn't that long ago. I mean, I'm not that old, so these are recent things. So I think it's really important for people, no matter which background you come from, to tell your stories, because there are a billion stories out there of their reality on this little beautiful planet that we're, you know, circling around the sun, this little spaceship we're traveling on.
The only thing I'll just add, if I can quickly, is you know, I think it's just stories are obviously so important, but one of the things that I see is how, you know, stories can be told in so many different ways, right? And I guess one of the things that I'm just kind of more and more coming to terms with is how even things like language frame our worldview, right? Like the kind of the languages that we speak, that we understand, help us interpret the world in potentially very different ways. And one of the things I think that I wasn't able to focus on in the book, but I did try to at least acknowledge, is this whole emphasis, and I know this is, you know, writing as activism, but is the whole emphasis that exists on the written word, right? Where many cultures, I mean, many Indigenous cultures here, but also many cultures across the world are based on oral tradition. And there are all kinds of stories that have been erased over the years, over generations. And I kind of wonder what, from the perspective of us all as you know, the quote unquote human race, how much we've missed out. And so by losing those stories. And so autobiographies can be important, but sometimes I wonder whether the emphasis on the individual is also a reflection of the neoliberal societies that we live in that are, that are focused on the individual. Where, I have a section in the book where I talk about monuments cast shadows, right? So when we create these monuments to individuals, they cast these shadows to many other people who do important work and movements who do important work that are often erased. So I think for me, autobiographies have played a role when I think back to people who I've read, but I guess I would also hope that there's an emphasis put on understanding that, change historically has never, ever come from one person. It's always come through movements, through people working together, through people developing relationships, friendships, and that's what's gonna change. So I definitely see the importance of autobiographies for us to learn from, but I hope that we can also expand that to understanding how communities have struggled and have learned and have developed knowledge and shared knowledge as we go forward.
Great. The next question is for you, Samir. It's from Mark Abley. I think the idea of story is something that transcends the fiction/nonfiction divide. Oh, sorry, it's for Ellen and Samir. Ellen, I'm happy to hear you're working on a book telling your own story. Samir, you told me at the end of your incredibly intense and arduous writing process that you didn't intend to write another book. Have you changed your mind? Have you found another story that captures your heart and mind enough to make the core of a new book?
Hi, Mark. So the answer is no for now. I mean, I think one of the things that's really, Mark knows probably better than many other people, aside for a handful, but writing the book was not a pleasant experience for many reasons. One was the timeline was very tight, but two, obviously the subject was really heavy. And it definitely takes a toll, an emotional and psychological toll, writing something like that. But the other element is that the fact that it did take time and energy, the real challenge, one of the biggest challenges for me was that I felt like it took me away from a lot of the activism, organizing work that I've been involved with more long-term. And that is kind of really what fuels me, and that's what fuels the book, really. So that's the part that's really hard to figure out going forward. If ever I were to write another book, is how to manage that time consideration and the responsibilities that have come with the book, because I think that's another thing that's really important. I wasn't prepared for, when I wrote the book, I wasn't necessarily anticipating the responsibilities that were going to come after I wrote the book. I felt like there was responsibilities to the people I talk about and write about, but I didn't realize that there would be responsibilities that would come after. But what the book has done is that there have been, families and communities who have reached out, who are still looking for loved ones, for example, who have been disappeared into the healthcare system, who are fighting to expose the healthcare system's involvement in the forced and coerced sterilization of Indigenous women and girls here in Quebec. These kinds of really important issues and struggles. And so now I feel like I have a responsibility to these people who have reached out, these communities, to support their work moving forward. And that's something I didn't anticipate, but it's really important, and it comes with I guess putting something out there. So to answer Mark's question, for now, no, because I feel like there's so much that has to be done still coming, tied to medical colonialism, and in Quebec, for example, implementing Joyce's principle would be high priority in that regard.
I'll just jump in to say we have time for the last question, so choose the question wisely, Laurie.
I actually have been going through them in chronological order in which they came in, because I think that's fair. So I'll continue with that. The next question is actually in French. Samir and Ellen, are you okay with my reading it in French? or would you like me to? Okay. This is from, oh, okay, we're having translation, great. From Leila Merabet. D'une part, j'aimerais remercier les intervenants pour votre générosité dans les échanges. J'aimerais savoir comment chacune et chacun de vous approchez un sujet pour un livre et que vous nous expliquiez un peu ce qu'est le processus de création pour vous. Je vous remercie et bonne continuité.
Samir, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say because I feel like, I mean, I kind of joked at the QWF gala that there's a bit of an imposter syndrome that's often there for me, because I don't necessarily consider myself a writer. This was really when I thought of writing the book, it was really after Barrett's comments and after Legault's persistently denying systemic racism. That's when I said that how can that happen when there was this practice that was longstanding, this campaign that exposed systemic racism so clearly? How can someone still maintain that level of denial? It's obviously political, but that was the main impetus for writing the book. And Mark is going to remember that when I initially pitched my proposal, it was 40 to 60,000 words, and I ended up being closer, well over 120,000 words in the end. But so I guess it's hard for me to answer that question because I feel like I didn't have, I had a lot of support and I had a lot of people I could ask questions to. But it was very difficult. It was kind of a process, it was a creative process that was happening as the writing was happening too. I didn't know it was gonna end up the way it did. And sometimes there are things that happen that you can't anticipate. So, as I was working on the early manuscript is when the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls came out with the report concluding that a genocide has occurred in Canada. And that ended up shifting the way I wrote the book, because then that's when I decided that, part 3 of the book is going to focus on genocide, with each chapter corresponding to each act of the UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide. So all to say that these things, I guess the one lesson, if anything, I learned was being able to adapt and to kind of, be dynamic. Because if you stick to a plan, or you try to stick to a plan, that's not necessarily gonna work out.
Ellen, would you like to add something?
Yeah, I think the creative process for me changes from day to day. It depends on what is happening. But I feel sometimes I feel inspired by human rights. I work with a lot of human rights advocates at the UN, nationally as well, and learning how they make sense of the dysfunction of what I grew up in what previous generations have grown up in, and trying to make sense. Trying to make sense of things I think is part of the creative process. It's trying to understand your realities. I'm an artist as well, a visual artist. I recently graduated in documentary, so which was another form of storytelling, and it's all about telling stories that people can follow and make sense. It's about remembering the beauty of being human. It's trying to work through pain sometimes of being human, and it's also for me especially, I get inspired by the environment, the natural world, and that spiritual world of ancestral teachings that talk about we're not the most important species on this planet. So I get inspired by so many things, and a lot of it is from those ancestral teachings and the people like yourselves and Samir that I've met over the years who sort of give me the message that colonization is still happening, but at least there are people who we can walk side by side in, and to me that's inspiring. Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you, Samir, for everything.
Thank you, Ellen. I will add to Leila that maybe there is more answers to her question in some of the QWF workshops unfortunately it will be in English, but that's I guess somewhere that she can find answers to that. We have reached our time. I know we have many more questions. Sorry, we won't be able to get to them. I really, from the deepest point in my heart, thank Samir and Ellen for being with us today. I personally enjoyed this very much. I hope they have as well. I thank our audience, and I thank Lori for stepping in with the questions. And I hope you stay tuned to other Quebec Writers Federation events and to Muslim Awareness Week events as well. Thank you very much, and all the best to everybody.